Okay, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So before we start talking about types of retailers, I want you to keep the information that we're talking about in mind, because this might help you to start to think about how you want to structure your retail store concept. And so if you see an idea that you like, you might want to jot that down as a strategy that you want to take. So just as a side note. So we are going to begin by talking about what types of retailers there are and why it's important to talk about this. So in terms of retailing, it really wasn't until the late 1880s when mass consumers were able to purchase manufactured merchandise. So it's still a relatively new concept in the scope of history. So up until we get to the 1880s, only wealthy people could afford to have clothing custom made. But now, if we look at what is available, there is really a wide variety of merchandise that retailers can offer. But you have to have a strategy to be successful in doing this. And that's why we talk about types of retailers. So to be successful, retailers ultimately have to understand the nature of what and who their competition is. And to know your competition, you have to know the different types of retailers. It's sort of like a keep your friends close and your enemies closer sort of situation. So there's two main categories of retailers that are important. And these categories encompass all of the channels of retailing that make up a multi-channel approach. So remember last week we talked about multi-channel retailing. So these help to comprise that concept. So the first category is on-site retailers. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's a retailer with a physical store location. So in other words, somewhere that you can visit. And then an off-site retailer is, again, exactly what it sounds like. So retailers with a non-physical and in modern times, often a web-based platform. So you then use these non-physical web-based platforms to sell your merchandise. And as a retailer, you can choose to have an on-site presence, off-site, or both. And you can be multi-channel in an on-site way, an off-site way, or both. So there's going to be different configurations for every apparel and textile retailer and how they adopt these types of retailing. So let's go ahead and start with talking about our on-site retailers. So how is this configured? The first type of retailer is a brick and mortar operation. So what we mean by this is basically it's a catch-all term for a physical presence of a retailer. And the other part of this term is that a brick and mortar retailer is able to offer a face-to-face experience. So again, speaking to that physical presence. And brick and mortar retailing is one of the oldest and most traditional forms of retailing. So here on the slide, you can see examples of physical locations and their storefronts for the store Brooks Brothers and Nasty Gal. So Nasty Gal is an interesting case because they only opened their first brick and mortar location in 2014. So they actually did things backwards than a lot of traditional retailing strategies. It's often been common throughout history to start a brick and mortar store first and then adopt an off-site presence. But they did it backwards or differently from a lot of retailers. And so this actually shows a huge shift in the way that retail businesses and strategies are being built. How many of you know Nasty Gal or are fans? Awesome, me too. So the next type of retailer is the fashion specialty store. So the fashion specialty store is a store that concentrates on specific and specialized merchandise. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can focus on selling a particular brand, or you can focus on selling a particular type of product. So, for example, a store that exclusively sells shoes would be considered a specialized store. And that's because they're selling a particular type of product. So the styles may change, the brands could change that they offer, but it still remains that they are focusing on the specialized product of shoes. And it's interesting because the retail industry itself doesn't necessarily follow a very specific definition of a specialty store. So oftentimes it has been the task of the fashion industry to really define this term. So sometimes it's been the case in the fashion industry that a chain retail store will sell a specific brand of clothing or clothing that is manufactured specifically for that store. So an example of this is if you go into the Gap and you buy a shirt, they are a specialized fashion store because a product you purchase will have a Gap label in it. So that's how you would define it as selling a particular brand. And then some major fashion specialty stores in addition to the Gap are H&M and DSW Shoes, which you see an image of on the right there. Do you have DSW Shoes out there? Do you know that brand? Okay. Sometimes they can be very regional, so it's nice to know. So the next retailer is the department store. So this is the one that most consumers are familiar with. Department stores are retailers that carry a very broad variety and deep assortment. So when I say deep assortment, what I mean is that they carry a variety of a similar or the same style or product, but it's going to have an assortment of color and size, and also maybe pattern. So department stores also offer customer services. That's something that is part of that definition of retailer. And they also do what is in their name. They organize their store into distinct departments. And this serves the purpose of helping them to display their merchandise. So some of the largest department store chains that are currently popular in the United States include Macy's and Kohl's. And one of the oldest and most traditional department stores in the United States is Sears. And Sears has actually experienced a lot of ups and downs in recent years because, as we talked about on the first day of class, they haven't necessarily kept up with trends or put money and resources into visual merchandising. So a department store is also characterized by its location. So it's usually housed in a large mall and a heavily populated area. And a department store might also be what you call an anchor store. So this is a big store that you put in a mall that will help attract foot traffic and customers. So if I see a map of a mall, for example, and Macy's is there, the idea is that by having that big department store, it will attract customers to browse the mall and look in other stores. So you can see in these photos that there's different departments for specific types of products. So you can see there's a separate department for purses and bags. There's a separate department for men's professional and formal wear and ties specifically. And then there's also a store directory in department stores. And this helps customers to find their way around. And it also speaks to what a vast assortment of merchandise they house in their store. So in keeping with talking about department stores, there's 3 tiers that you have to be aware of. So the first tier includes very upscale, high fashion chains. So department stores with multiple locations. And they're known for selling exclusive designer merchandise. The second tier includes more of your traditional department stores. So those with very well-known kind of mass market names. And in these stores, retailers are selling more modestly priced merchandise. They also have less customer service. And the third tier, so at the bottom, you have value-oriented merchandise. And this retailer, in terms of department stores, caters to the more price-conscious consumer. So looking at these definitions, I want you to, with the people next to you, I want you to see if you can identify an example of each of these types of department stores. So you can work with the people in your row, just take like 2 or 3 minutes and see what examples you come up with.
I had to do a
Okay, so let's come back together as a group. So, who wants to share an example of a Tier 1 department store that they came up with? Yes. Okay, I see, let's see, 3 hands.
Like, go first.
Okay, Shui, you want to help me with the name tags that I can't
Yes.
see?
First is Nico.
Thank you.
My group said Saks or Neiman Marcus.
Yes, so those would be examples of a Tier 1 department store. Very good. Okay. Are there others that weren't named that you had?
Yes. Erica.
Erica, thank you.
We weren't sure, but maybe we thought Nordstrom because they kind of have like high price like designers.
Yes, so Nordstrom would be a Tier 1 department store. Very good.
How
Any
about,
others?
yes. Can I see your name? Oh, Kohler and Natasha later. Yes, Kohler.
Did they just say Bloomingdale's?
No, that is another one. Very good.
How about Natasha?
We thought like Versace or something.
So Versace is actually going to be another type of retailer. that's outside of the department store realm. So we're gonna, it is a upscale high fashion retailer, but it's actually a different classification than a department store. But good thinking.
Yes, one more, Erica.
Barney.
Barney.
That one could qualify on a smaller scale. Yes. Yes. Okay, so how about tier 2?
Yes, Destiny.
Like Dillard's, Macy's.
Yes, good. Those are 2. Anything else you thought?
What about Polo that goes in Dillard's?
Say that one more time.
Polo that goes in Dillard's.
Oh, like Ralph Lauren Polo? So that's actually going to be a boutique inside of a retailer, so that would be a department in it. So, so when you think of department store, think of the entire store layout. And that's, and we'll talk more about how that fits in. But if it's a specific, if it looks like a small store or a boutique inside a department store, that's just one part of the department store. But good thinking, yes.
Would Von Maur be one?
That could be one on a smaller scale, yes. Yep.
What about Marshall's?
So Marshall's is, that's a good guess, and it is a type of department store, but it's actually going to be in more of our tier 3 classification. And it also falls into another type of classification that we'll talk about too. So good thinking. And I would also like to say, I can tell that some of you did your reading, and that really makes me happy. So good job. Tier 3, examples?
Yes. Can I see your name? Oh, Melissa.
Melissa, thank you.
JCPenney's.
Yes, that is one. Very good. So that's more of a price-conscious, value-oriented type of merchandise. Very good. What's another?
Yes, Nico.
Sears.
Yes, Sears would be one too. Very good. And sometimes you might find that tier 3, they're less concerned with fashion, or they're going to be the last stop for fashion trends. That's not always true, but it is often true. Any others?
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, Alex.
Thank you.
Kohl's.
Kohl's, yes, good. So those would be the 3 dominant ones that I would think of. So Sears, JCPenney, and Kohl's. So that's one thing that can also help you as you move forward with your retail store concepts, is to think about not only what classifies as a retailer of a certain kind, but also to think about who is their competitor, and that will help you to identify who your competitor might be or who you want to source your merchandise from. So the next classification brings us back to the Versace example. So that is couture and designer fashion boutiques. So for the upscale fashion consumer, there are more and more designers and couturiers who are opening their own boutiques. So if you understand the flow of fashion merchandise, this may be a refresher, but remember that couture garments and avant-garde looks are at the top of the pyramid. And then they filter down at various levels. So when it comes to retail, often what happens is that a high-profile designer will create something in their atelier or their studio, but then they have to figure out how to sell it. So that's why they started to open their own independent boutiques. And usually what happens is the first store that they open will be in the country where they first designed their collections or started as a designer. And this concept only really began about 20 or so years ago. And if you think about the timing of that, about 20 or so years ago, it's a little more now, so 25 or so years, we'll say. This was around the time of excess that was happening in the late 80s and early 90s. So it makes sense that designer boutiques pop up. And it also gives designers a way to sell their merchandise outside of a department store. So up until that point, that was the traditional way for designers to sell their merchandise, was to buy space in a department store. So this continues to grow as a trend, and boutiques are now all over the world for a variety of labels. And you can see this when you travel, first and foremost. So, for example, Ralph Lauren, which is based in the United States, they operate over 350 stores around the world. So they've really expanded their boutique presence. And when we think about why these boutiques are popular, it can be attributed to people traveling, as I mentioned. So that brings attention to different brands. There's also a lot of exposure for brands on the internet. And then there is a desire for consumers to have couture level products or original designs in their customer base. So that's often upper class consumers, but it could be people with disposable income as well. So these boutiques, you may have noticed in different locations, are located in areas of tourism because it's been found that tourists are more likely to make impulse purchases. So they also draw in what's known as the aspirational consumer. And that is a consumer that will browse a store to catch a glimpse of high-profile fashions by famed designers. So they wander the store or look at the storefront as a way to think about, I want to own that. That's what I want to buy at some point. And we all aspire to own different things depending on our style. So I've included a couple of tourism and aspirational customer examples here. Boutiques, in terms of their interior and their presence, even if they are in an area of tourism, they have a smaller quantity of merchandise. So that's something important to know about boutiques. They have more limited merchandise. And the picture on the top right, that's an image of a Zac Posen boutique in New York. If you look to the bottom left, this is a Kate Spade boutique in Waikiki, Hawaii. So this is one of their top selling stores because there are such huge numbers of tourism to Waikiki. And then I've also included this example. I was looking through photos recently, and this is a funny example of a trip that I took with some friends to Las Vegas a couple of years ago. And all of us love Christian Louboutin. And so we took a picture in front of the store. And you can even see how much of aspirational consumers we are just by what I wrote. So I said, needless to say, there isn't a better place for us to pose for a picture. We were in heaven. We even walked around the boutique and dreamed a little. Okay, maybe we dreamed a lot. So that is such a clear example of what it means to be aspirational. And we, in fact, did wander around the store. We went in, and I almost did buy a pair of shoes, and then I talked myself out of them, and then found a pair that I liked better later. So that speaks to the impulse purchase thing as well. So that's the draw and the idea behind boutiques. So now we're going to start to go down into a different subset of price point and also a different type of consumer with the type of retailer. So we're going to talk next about off-price merchants. So an off-price merchant is one that stocks privately held merchandise. And this merchandise that they stock is unique because it is the cast-off of manufacturers. So they didn't source it originally, and they didn't commission to have it made. They are basically reaping the benefits of merchandise that was a slow seller in a store, or it is from a past season, or it's out of season. So, for example, if it's winter and a retailer has summer apparel to get rid of, or it's an overrun by a manufacturer. So an overrun means that the manufacturer has made too much for a retailer or brand to sell. And sometimes this happens because they get an order from a buyer that is too much quantity for a product. So we call off-price merchants opportunistic purchasers, because the main thing that they are looking for is that the merchandise is cheap. So it's a very low price. So in order to be opportunistic, they have to seek out this merchandise. So they have to make relationships with manufacturers and with wholesalers. And they have to determine what they can sell for a smaller price to help sell it and get it off the shelves. And then they still make a profit. So this practice with off-price merchants, examples of which are TJ Maxx and Marshalls. So we talked about Marshalls already. It really began back in the early 1950s. So there was a woman named Frida Lohman, and you can see the spelling of Lohman on the image there in green. She actually started to operate out of her bedroom in Brooklyn, New York with this very practice. And she's actually credited with starting this practice, which has become huge in retail. So she actually went and physically sought out merchandise to sell at a lower cost on 7th Avenue in New York, and to sell it at less than the wholesale price. And she saw such an overwhelming response to this practice that she ended up opening a brick and mortar store. And that's how all of this was born. And the image that you see there with Loehmann's, this is in their store in 1988. And you can see that there isn't much to the interior of the store, but the shoppers don't seem to mind because they're getting access to lower priced merchandise. And this is a preview of a fall fashion event. So the United States, interestingly enough, is the leading dominant place for this type of merchandising. Other countries have yet to catch up to the level of off-price merchandising that the United States has. And as many of you are probably aware, being college students, and I was the same way when I was a college student, off-price merchants are our best friend, right? It allows us to find interesting things and at a lower price. And so there's an example here on the slide. At TJ Maxx, there's this Maggie London dress, a pretty well-known designer that sells at a department store for $148. And at TJ Maxx, this woman was able to get it for $29.99. Those are the types of deals we love, right? I love them. That's one of my favorite things to do. And somehow there's a psychology to it that allows consumers to feel better about what they're purchasing. And then they often purchase more in this type of retail environment because of that. So a subset of that is the independent off-price merchant. So these are retailers with a specific brand or a designer label, like Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren. And they offer designer-specific merchandise in an off-price physical location. So in this case, a brand or a designer label will actually sell its own merchandise via a location that's different from their, say, boutique location. And what's important here is that they still get to keep their brand image and their own visual merchandising, because they don't have to sell it at a more generalized or off-price merchant. So somewhere like TJ Maxx. So it's basically viewed by the consumer as just another one of their retail stores. And then an example of this type of store would be Emporio Armani. So you can see an image of that storefront there. And another one would be Polo Ralph Lauren, which is often a staple at outlet malls. So what other stores do you often see at outlet malls that fit this independent off-price merchant category?
Polo.
Polo, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, good. Others?
J. Crew.
J. Crew, yes, that is often a common one too. Anywhere else that's your go-to place when you go to an outlet mall? Mine is BCBG. That's my outlet mall guilty pleasure. So so that speaks to being able to give the consumer the product at a lower price but still maintain brand image. Then another similar aspect is a department store clearance outlet. So a department store clearance outlet actually serves the greater good when it comes to a department store, because it is next to impossible to sell out of a season's merchandise. So even if you have the best planning tools and expert buyers, you still cannot predict every purchase and sale down to the penny and inventory stock. So as a result of that, department stores have gotten smart, and they've developed their own clearance outlets. And this is very similar to the independent off-price merchants, because they still get to retain their brand image and their brand loyalty and their visual merchandising. So another thing that this does for the department store is that it helps to free up space for next season's fashions. And it allows them to do that because they operate this clearance outlet in a separate physical location. So then they get to physically move the inventory to another location so that they can bring new inventory in. And this is especially helpful because it allows the retail stores to keep up with the fast fashion cycle that has come to be known in the last decade or so. So examples of this type of retailer are Off Fifth, that's operated by Saks Fifth Avenue. So you can see an example of that here on the slide. And then there's also Last Call, that's operated by Neiman Marcus. So notice in these images that the stores are still presented as a traditional brick and mortar store, but it's more plain than the regular location might be. And that's because they're selling at a lower price, and so they want to put in less money and resources to that physical location to cover their costs. There's also the category of warehouse clubs. So when you think about fashion and apparel and textiles, you might not think of places like Costco and Sam's Club as your go-to place, right? However, there is a growing market for these warehouse clubs and apparel and textiles. So a warehouse club offers limited assortment of products, but in an irregular assortment and quantity. So by that, we mean that it's a larger quantity than you would see at a more traditional retail setup. And it's called a club because you have to have a membership. And so it almost looks like a department store inside, but it has greater assortment and greater quantity. Or more limited assortment, but greater quantity, sorry. So as we said, they have a warehouse categorization for a reason. They have very simple interiors. So concrete floors, very plain metal shelves, and maybe some racks for clothes, but again, very plain metal. But customers are actually attracted to this type of retailer because they can stock up on large packs of basic apparel and textile items. There might also be fashion brands like Danskin is one that's popular with people to do yoga or athletic activities. They also, Costco has started selling Michael Kors garments as well at a reduced cost. And then don't forget that in addition to apparel, we also cover things that are made with textiles. So bedding sets and pillows, anything of that nature can be considered a textile. So then we come to discount operations. So discount operations have a bottom line of reaching mass markets with low prices. And usually what that means is that it's a discounted price for a product that you can find that is similar or the same for a higher price at another location. So retailers like Target and Walmart are examples of discount operations. And there's something interesting that's happening now with discount operations because they are partnering with these high-profile fashion brands to create collections or lines that can be offered to the mass market consumer at a lower price than they could find product in a boutique of the same designer. So, for example, there are collaborations that have happened at Kohl's with Vera Wang. So you can see an example of that on the slide here. And even Walmart has partnered with, at one point it was considered a big deal. It isn't so much anymore, but they partnered with Levi's, which was a high profile and is now making a comeback as a high-profile jeans provider. So Target, as we talked about on the first day of class, has made collaborations with Lilly Pulitzer, Alexander McQueen, Proenza Schouler, and Rodarte. So this impacts sales because they get to create a customer base who wants those products. And they're still reaching the mass market at a low price. So this is something that's an up-and-coming trend that continues to increase at discount operations. And then there is the franchise. So the franchise is actually something that is lesser known in the world of apparel and textiles retailing, but it does happen. So when you have a franchise, you have a franchisor who owns the right to the retail concept and the merchandise that helps to create that concept. So then they offer the franchisee, so someone who wants to open a location, of the retailer, they get the opportunity to open a location for a startup fee. So what they might say is, okay, if you want to open one of my stores, I'm going to charge you, often a going rate is anywhere between $50,000 to $150,000 to franchise a retail store. And that includes everything. So the operating ledgers, hiring practices for employees, stock records, so what you've purchased, trend records, sales records, everything. And then in return, once they start making a profit, they have to pay something back on a regular basis that they work out with the franchisor. So some franchises have been successful in fashion. United Colors of Benetton has actually been successful at one time with this model. They aren't anymore, but during like around the late 60s and the 70s, they perfected this model for the apparel industry. But as they started to expand their franchises globally, it started to collapse. So they kind of spread themselves too thin. And there wasn't enough communication between the franchisor and the franchisees. Another example, and something that a lot of you listed on your All About Me surveys as a favorite, is Zara. So they are based out of Spain, and they really pride themselves on allowing self-ownership of their stores and franchising. And one of the things that makes them a successful franchisor is that they have a very clear system of how they communicate within their network. So this allows them to create new designs very quickly and get them out to stores very quickly. That makes them faster than any other apparel franchise that's currently practicing retail today. So that's why you often see them talked about in industry publications and the news. They are considered one of the top 3 most successful retailers right now. And another that you are probably familiar with that's become popular is the pop-up shop. So this is something that is pretty unique to the apparel and textile industry. They really started the popularity of it, and then other retailers have followed. So what a pop-up shop really equates to is a temporary outlet for selling a brand or company's merchandise. And these locations can really be set anywhere. So it could be in the parking lot of a neighborhood. Sometimes people have done that on a smaller scale. It could be in a mall. It could also be on college campuses. So this is growing in popularity as a trend. So some of the brands that have used pop-up shops are Levi's and Adidas and Gap. And you can see here on the slide an example of an Adidas pop-up shop that was staged and traveled around Europe. So it's shaped like one of their giant shoe boxes. And if that doesn't draw customers in, I don't know what will. That's pretty enticing, and it sends a big message. So oftentimes they find very creative ways to bring people in like this as well. And some of the reasons that pop-up shops are successful is because you can have lower rent with a smaller space. You can travel around, if it's a case like this traveling shoebox, to reach more consumers. And say if you get a location in a mall, you can lease for a shorter amount of time. So you don't have to rent a very large space. You can have a low commitment and then move out or move somewhere else if you want. And then some retailers or brands also use this as an opportunity to test market their products. So if something doesn't work in a pop-up shop, they might scrap it and introduce something else. So that brings us to our off-site retailers. So the first off-site retailer is the catalog. Catalogs were actually one of the first types of retailing. So historically, Sears was one of the first to start a catalog. And the original idea behind this was that you could reach people that would be possible consumers if they were in a rural area and couldn't come to a store. Or sometimes people might not have time to visit. And those same ideas still hold true. But now it's also a source of convenience. So not just if you live rurally, but just if you want to get something from it anytime. So when we define what a catalog is, it's really just a printed book of images and descriptions of merchandise for sale. And it's off-site because you order it from the book through a third party, and then you deliver it to the consumer. So in 2013, there was a research firm that reported that 12.5 billion catalogs were sent to US households. So we get them on a fairly regular basis if we don't ask for them, right? At least once a month, if not more. But they found that sending out that many catalogs only yielded a 29% rate of purchase from consumers. So that's quite low, especially for the resources it takes to make and send out a catalog. So catalogs have sort of diminished over the years, and they're still fairly limited at this point and not relied on as much. But Victoria's Secret still has one. JCPenney. You also have stores like Toys R Us and Neiman Marcus that sell apparel and textile-based products as a marketing technique. So Neiman Marcus has their wish book every Christmas, and that helps to promote their store. And then the one that most of us are best familiar with is e-tailing. So e-tailing, which we defined in class on our first day, has really become the main source or staple of fashion merchandising and sales. And most major retailers now have some type of online presence. There are some companies that operate online only. So companies that you might see with an online-only presence are Bluefly.com, which you can see on the slide here. How many of you have shopped at Bluefly? Anybody? That one's not as popular. Okay. I bet you've shopped at this one, Amazon. And then also Overstock.com. Is that one more popular to you than Bluefly? So e-tailing is really attractive because it allows you to have more global reach to consumers. Anyone, anytime can access it. You can also have a greater assortment of merchandise because you only have to source it from a warehouse instead of a brick and mortar location. So you can have greater access and more room rather than being confined to what your retail store will hold. And then you can also change out products very quickly from season to season, or fashion cycle to fashion cycle. So research shows that the average consumer reports as many as 20 retail-oriented emails per day. So that's another subset of e-tailing. So how many do you feel like you get on an average day? Like 5 or more, would you say?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a huge selling point for retailers. And a research firm has reported in 2014 that 89% of respondents at least click through to the retailer website from a retail email. So that shows a consumer base that they are reaching who's at least shopping the product. So some of the retailers that have become really good at this strategy are Nordstrom, Kate Spade, and Brooks Brothers. And there's always questions about how they get your email. So they get them from your in-store visit. Sometimes they are able to acquire it from when you purchase things with a credit card because there's information attached to your credit card account that you may not know. When you buy something online, that's another way. So it gives them an avenue to communicate with consumers. Another one that you probably know well is social networking. So research has shown that more than half of adults actively use social media. And that may sound like a small number in the grand scheme of things, but it's still a huge consumer base to reach. So Facebook and Pinterest are the most common social networks. And this is successful for a retailer because they can target a very specific demographic and interests of that demographic. So it allows them to participate in what is known as lifestyle merchandising. And when we say lifestyle merchandising, what we mean is showing how a product can be worn for either a certain activity or a certain time of day. So Zappos, which is a fashion shoe retailer, they actually have 1/3 of their corporate associates employed who sit on their Twitter account every day to respond to Zappos-related posts and to monitor consumer preferences and what they're talking about. So they are interested in customer acquisition. How can they get you to purchase based on what you're talking about? Some examples of this, Anthony Ryan, who is a designer that participated on Project Runway, if you know that name, he has a store in San Antonio, Texas called the Ant Hill, And he uses his Instagram account to show new items in the store and advertise sales. So that's one way. You can see an example of that here. Target uses their Pinterest account to show new collections and also participate in lifestyle merchandising. And then lastly, we have television shopping networks. So television shopping networks have often been considered a very cheesy form of retail, right? So off-kilter types of things from people that we don't even know, or things for older ladies. That's how it's often been thought of. But in the last 5 or so years, shopping networks like HSN, so the Home Shopping Network, and also QVC have been signing many high-profile designers. And this is advantageous for them because it gets their name out there, but it also allows QVC and HSN to churn out these ready-to-wear lines. And they can have a designer associated with a very mainstream product. So if you are a Project Runway fan, you may remember Seth Aaron from season 7, and he also won an all-star season. Actually, I can also say on a side note, it's really fun because we get to have Portland Fashion Week here, which is up and coming in Oregon and the US, and he always shows at Portland Fashion Week. And so it's always super fun to see him, and I've gotten to meet with him and hang out with him a little bit, so that's fun. But he launched Seth Aaron, SA by Seth Aaron, in 2014 on QVC. And it sells very well and is very successful. Isaac Mizrahi is another high-profile designer, at least he was at one time, for QVC, and he oversees other collections as well. So those are the types of retailers that you need to know, and keep those in mind, especially with the different brands and designers we talked about. So with that said, I will see you Thursday. And make sure that you start to think about your demographic survey, and maybe try and fill that out so we have more to work with on Thursday.